Hello and welcome to this lesson, which is BSP Geometry. In this lesson we're going to be taking a look at creating our maze, and we're going to be doing this by using BSP brushes. Using BSP brushes we're also going to be taking a look at geometry editing and also how we can create an escape hole using geometry subtraction. Okay, so just looking at a very simple design, we're going to break down our maze by first adding a floor into our level, and then we're going to add some surrounding walls onto the floor. And then we're going to build the interior parts of the maze, which will just be some more walls that we add inside these surrounding walls. And then of course we want to add an escape hole that our ball can escape through. Okay, so to start creating our own maze, we're going to start by adding in the floor. But we've already got a floor here, but we don't want to use this floor. So what I'm going to do is select it, and then I'm going to hold left shift as well to select the ball, and we can just move both of these out of the way. So how do we add some geometry into our level that we can start using and editing? Well, we can come up to the Window tab, and we can come to the Modes panel. And on here we can come to the geometry section. So these aren't static mesh actors, these are BSP brushes. And we can use BSP brushes to start blocking out our levels. Okay, but in our case we're going to be using these to create our maze. And we can see there's a few different shapes here that we can work with, but we're just going to focus on this box brush. And we can add the box brush to our level just by clicking and dragging it into the viewport. I've got grid snapping turned on and my grid size is set to 100 Unreal units. I'm going to reset the location of this brush actor to the center of the world by changing the location transform to 0, 0, 0. Our snapping size is set to 100, so we can see that one of these squares on the grid is 100 Unreal units in size, or 1 meter in size. Looking at the box, we can see that it fits on the grid across these two large squares on the face, which means that it's 200 units in size. If we look towards the details panel, we have this brush settings section, and it is telling us that the shape of our box is 200 units across the X, Y, and Z. And we can start changing the shape of our box by typing in new values here. So look, we can type in 100 on the X and Y to change this box to be 100 units for its width and its length. But we're going to use this box for our floor piece, and I want the height of it to be pretty thin. So I'm going to change the Z here to be 30 centimeters or 30 Unreal units. Okay, so that's a good height for our floor. We know we can change the shape of a box brush by adjusting these values on the details panel, but what we don't want to do is scale it with the scale transform tool in the viewport, because when we do this it stretches our materials, which will make our maze look a bit ugly. So I'm just going to hit Ctrl Z to undo this. So we want to make sure we use the brush settings on the details panel, and for my floor I'm going to change the X to be 1400 units and for the Y to be 2000 units. Okay, so this looks pretty good for my floor piece. Now let's take a look at adding in a wall piece. To do this we can just drag out another box brush, but with this box I want it to be the size of this square in the bottom left corner of our floor. So we can do this by changing the Y to 100 Unreal units. But look, if we zoom down to it, we can see that it sits in between one of these grid squares rather than being perfectly in place on the grid. So we can see this better when we start moving it. If we bring it to the edge of our floor, we can see that half of it is hanging over the edge of the floor. So to fix this, we just need to change our snapping size to 50 units, and then we can move it across so it sits nicely on the grid in place there. But we want to change the length of our wall to be the same length as our floor piece. So how can we do that? Well, we can switch over to the geometry editing mode. To do this, we want to come to our modes panel, and where we have all these icons, there is the geometry editing icon on the very end. So when we select this, we are in the edits mode, and this allows us to select a face on our box brush, and we could just use the translate tool to change the length of our face. And we can do the same for a different face, so I'm going to do the same for this top face here to change the height. So to summarize, when editing BSP brush shapes, we can use the brush settings on the details panel, and we can also use the geometry editing mode from the modes panel. This allows us to select faces and use the translate tool to change the length of them. But we don't want to use the scale tool in the viewport because this causes stretching of the materials. So I've still got this face selected on my wall. I can deselect it by hitting escape, and we can deselect the actor again by hitting escape again. Let's take a look at applying materials onto these brushes. Well, if we come back to the content browser, we know in the starter content we have the materials folder. And we know if we drag and drop materials, usually it would apply it across the whole actor, but it's only applying it onto a single face. Okay, so we can technically drag and drop different materials onto different faces here. But what if we want to apply a material across the board, across all the different faces on our brush? Well, we can select the actor, and we can see on the details panel we have this select button. We can select this and hit select all adjacent surfaces. And we have this surface materials section, and this says display free materials. If we hit this, it shows us all the materials we have on our brush, and we can just drag and drop a single material onto this to combine it all into one material there. Okay, so let's come back to the Place tab on the Modes panel, which is the first icon, and let's come to the Geometry section, and let's add another box while we've got the material selected. And because we've got the material selected, it's applied the material across all the faces on the brush. So let's take a look at finishing off the rest of the walls. Let's make this box go from this end of the floor to the opposite end. So to do this, on my brush settings, I'm going to change the X value to be 100 units, and take note that we're still on 50 units of snapping here. We can just use the translate tool and move this into place. We can switch to the geometry editing mode from the Modes panel, and we can select the top face of the brush, and we can extend it to the same height of the other wall. If we select the side face, we can extend this face to the same length of the floor. Okay, and we can easily create the surrounding walls by coming back to the place mode, and if we select one of the walls, we can hold down the left alt and just click and drag to duplicate it, and we can duplicate them into place quite easily. Okay, and we also want to apply the material to the floor, so we can select it and then select all adjacent surfaces and drag and drop our floor material on there. So now I have a challenge for you. Using what we've learned, I want you to create your maze. To do this, make sure that you've got a floor and some surrounding walls as we've just set up, but I also want you to set up your interior walls to create your maze. And your maze can be as big and as small as you like. But I also want you to apply materials to all the faces on the walls and the floors. So pause the video here, have fun making a maze, and hop on back and hit resume when you're ready. Okay, so this is my simple maze that I've created just by using a combination of the geometry editing tools and the brush settings when we are working with the box brush. So we can bring our ball back and we can just choose our starting point over here. And let's think about an end point for our maze. So somewhere where the ball can escape from. We want to cut a hole into the floor. So how do we do that? Well, if we come back into the place mode on the modes panel and then geometry, look, we can hit additive or subtractive modes. Okay, so we've been working in additive mode, but if we go into subtractive and drag out a box, it will cut out geometry for us. And we just want to make sure that the subtractive box is inside the geometry of our floor, and we can see that it cuts a hole there for us. And we can just use the regular brush settings just to make sure that we have a hole large enough that the ball can escape through. Okay, so in the next lesson we're going to take a look at converting our maze into a single static mesh actor. So when you're happy with the design of your maze, let's hop on into the next lesson. Hey, welcome back. In the previous lesson, we made use of BSP brushes to start blocking out a maze. And BSP is good for designing and blocking out levels, but it's fairly limited. For example, BSP brushes cannot be used in blueprints, and we want to use our maze we have designed in our level blueprint. So in this lesson, we're going to cover how we can convert all our BSP geometry down to a single static mesh. And we're also going to be taking a look at different ways we can apply collision to a static mesh, and we're also going to replace the floor actor reference in our level blueprint with our newly created maze static mesh. Okay, so we want to take our BSP box brushes and we want to convert them to a single static mesh. To convert a BSP box brush to a static mesh, we can select it, and when we scroll down on the details panel to where we have our brush settings, we can expand this little white arrow just on the bottom of the section here. You can see this little white arrow. When we hover over it, it says show advanced. When we click here, we have some buttons, and look, we have a create static mesh button. We're not going to click it just yet. What we want to do is select the whole maze and then convert that to a static mesh. But in order for us to do that, look what happens to our pivot point. If I look at the world outliner and if I select all the box brushes, look at where our pivot point is. It's towards the final actor that we have selected. So if we were to rotate the maze as we were doing with the floor, it's going to rotate it around its axis just there, which isn't good for our maze. We want it to be on the center of the floor. Okay, so look, if we just select half of these, we can see that the pivot point goes here. If we select these, we can see the pivot point goes there. So we want to make sure we select the floor last. So probably the best way to do this is to select the floor. So we know which one the floor is. Let's just hit F2 when we have it selected in the world outliner, and let's just rename this to box brush floor. So we know the floor is the last one. So in the world outliner, we can select the top one, and then we can shift select all the way down to the bottom, and the floor is selected last. And now we can go ahead and create the static mesh on the details panel, because look, our pivot point is in the center, so this is perfect for us. Okay, so we can hit create static mesh, and it's going to ask us where we want to save it. Let's create a new folder in the content browser. If we right click on the big content folder, and we can hit new folder, and we can just name this mazes, and we can just name the static mesh name maze 1, and we can just hit create static mesh. Okay, and now we have our maze collapsed down to a single static mesh, and we can see that we have this little red message here saying that lighting needs to be rebuilt. This is because our maze is listed as static. If you remember, in a previous lesson we set our floor actor to be movable. So we want to do the same for the maze, and just like with the floor, we're going to be changing the transform of our maze dynamically with blueprints while playing the game. So we can come to the details panel and then change it in the transform section from static to movable. We can also find our maze in the content browser. We added it to a new folder named mazes, and when we come here we can see that we have a single static mesh just named maze 1, and we can double click on the static mesh to open it inside the static mesh window. And this just gives us a complete overview of our static mesh, and we can also apply collision here, but we're going to be taking a look at this shortly. Let's come back to the editor because I now have a challenge for you. Okay, so right now I want you to take your box brushes that make up your maze, and I want you to convert it into a static mesh actor. And remember, you need to select the floor last for the centered pivot point. So pause the video here, and when you have your static mesh actor ready, let's continue the lesson. So I'm assuming you have your maze converted down to a static mesh actor now. And now I want you to make sure you have your maze selected in the viewport, and with it selected in the viewport, let's come to the level blueprint. So our mouse input is controlling the floor actor, but we want to update our code so we can control the maze actor with our mouse input. So to do this, we can just replace the floor references with our maze reference. So because we have our maze selected in the viewport, we can right click and we can create a reference to our maze, and we can just plug this straight into the target and replace the reference here, and we can just delete the floor reference. Okay, we can do the same over where we set the actor rotation. We can create the reference and then just plug it in and then delete the floor reference. Okay, and now we can come back to the editor, and we want to make sure that we adjust our player start just so we can get a good view of the maze for the player when we are playing the game. So just using the translate and rotate tools, I can set this in place here. And when we're ready, we can hit play and just check out the view. And we can also see that we've got control of our floor actor here. And I'm just going to adjust my player start just a bit closer and more to the center of the maze here. So when we press play, we can see that the ball falls straight through our maze. Our maze has no collision, so we need to fix this. Let's come into the maze 1 static mesh by double clicking on it inside the content browser. So we have no collision at all on our static mesh, and with static meshes we can apply collision by coming up to the collision menu just next to File and Edit, and when we click this we can apply different types of collision. Let's just take a look at what happens when we add a box simplified collision. So this adds a box collision primitive that covers our whole mesh, and look, we can use the translate tool to move this so we can see it better. And we can see that this is one whole solid piece of collision, but this is no good for us really because we have a much more complex shape than just a simple box. So what else can we do? Well, there's two solutions to this. Solution one is to scale the collision primitive and make it fit the size of the wall, and then we can keep adding more box collisions by alt dragging and duplicating the collision. But this is going to take some time and it's going to be iffy and difficult to do. So let's take a look at solution 2. Solution 2 is really not the best option in terms of developing a larger game, but for our marble run game and our maze static mesh actor, this is going to be just fine. I'm going to select and delete both box collision primitives, and we can apply collision to each face of our model by scrolling down on the details panel, and we can come to the collision section. And here we have collision complexity, and we can use this drop down just next to it, and we can apply collision to each face of our model by selecting use complex collision as simple. There is a solution 3, but that would require us to use a 3D modeling application such as Blender, and we're not going to dive into that in this course. So for this lesson, solution 2 is going to work just fine for us. So let's close out of the static mesh window and let's switch back to the editor and let's just hit play. So we can now see that the ball collides with our maze, and we can rotate the maze with our mouse and we can start guiding the ball to the hole we cut in the floor to make it escape the maze. So in the next lesson, we're going to take a look at triggering an event in Blueprints for when our ball escapes the hole to give us a sort of win condition. So when you're ready, I'll see you in the next lesson.